Hello and thanks for joining us at interest.co.nz. I'm Jenée Tibshraeny and today I'm joined by National's finance spokesperson, Paul Goldsmith. Hi, Paul.
Hey, how are you?
Good, thank you. I'm impressed by your bookshelf.
Yes, well, this is the room which I've chosen to be my Zoom room for the period of lockdown, and it's not so bad.
Very good. Look, before we crack into a good chat about economics, I have to ask the question that everyone is asking at the moment, and that is Simon Bridges fit to be National Party's leader?
Well, absolutely. He's doing what everybody would expect the leader of the opposition to be doing, which is asking very basic questions about government policy. And we're at an incredible period where big decisions are being made. And I don't know, I might be, I don't think there's too many people would think that the Prime Minister is infallible and every decision is perfect. Actually, it needs to be questioned, and he's gone about that, asking reasonable questions, and some people, I think, are overreacting to that.
Look, Paul, I mean, 29,000 comments were made on a post that Simon Bridges did on his Facebook page when the government announced that the lockdown would be extended by a week. Most of those weren't so good, to put it nicely. And also 87% of people surveyed by Colmar Brunton are supportive of the government's response to COVID-19. I mean, being in opposition right now just cannot be easy, but what do you think National needs to change to get some more positive traction, I guess, among the public?
Look, we just keep chipping away and making, I think, perfectly reasonable points. And the one that we were making this week and continue to make is that, we have, at the start, we chose a very hard lockdown. The government's talked about going early and hard. It's a perfectly reasonable question to ask. Well, they didn't actually go all that early and hard on the border. Everybody knows that, a week into the lockdown, people were still turning up at the airport and going home into self-isolation, and the Prime Minister saying, the police will visit them, and the police saying, oh, no, we're actually not going to visit them. So they didn't go early and hard on that, but they certainly went very hard on the lockdown. And they made that decision, that's fine. But after 4 weeks of experience, with the numbers coming down and being able to look across the Tasman and see that they didn't go quite so hard in Australia, it's a perfectly reasonable question to ask, are we being, could we be doing more to open up the economy? And that's the point that we're trying to make in a positive way. And I think it's important because there's a lot at stake.
Paul, do you believe that we should be at level 3 now?
Our general belief is that we should be moving faster to open up the economy. If we look across the Tasman,
does that mean level 3 now? I just want to be clear on that.
What's that?
Does that mean we should have moved to level 3?
Look, we believe we should be moving as quickly as we safely can to open up the border. When we look at our level 3 is a very, there's a good argument that it's, well, actually, I heard on the radio this morning them saying, well, look, there's not much difference between level 4 and level 3 in practical terms. And for most people, it's very strict, even at level 3. And we think we could be doing more to open up the economy.
So that does mean level 3 this week or not, or just generally, because it's a general statement.
I don't want to get sort of high-bound on whether it should be Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday, other than to say I think we should be moving more rapidly and should be looking across the Tasman, where they have been much more pragmatic and the outcomes have been very similar in health terms.
Okay. Look, in terms of I'd just like to talk now about the financial support that the government has provided. If you were Finance Minister now and we were approaching a time where that 12-week wage subsidy will run out, what would be the next step in terms of supporting businesses specifically?
Well, I mean, obviously the first point is the critical one, that we should be doing everything we can to allow those businesses to operate. We've gone for an ultra cautious approach or ultra conservative approach to the lockdown. I haven't heard a good argument from the Minister of Finance yet as to why the Australians have been able to do construction and retail and things like that, and we can't. And so the most important thing to do is to get New Zealanders back to work in a timely fashion. Then and it's a reasonable point to say, well, if you're going to be ultra conservative, you're going to keep people tied up for longer, then more business relief is justified. Now, the wage subsidy has been very substantial, $10 billion, and I think it has been quite effective in getting cash into the hands of businesses. If you look around the world internationally, it's not as generous as some others, but it has had the great advantage of being in cash early. And so that's worked, but I think we need to go further for those businesses directly affected by the extended lockdown.
Okay, so would you want to see that wage subsidy extended, or would you like to see support targeted at businesses that are particularly affected, like retail or hospitality? Or do you think that the financial support that's been provided to date is kind of enough?
Yeah, look, I think there's an argument for more support for those businesses directly affected going forward, and there are different ways to deliver that. One approach would be to extend the wage subsidy for particular groups. I think there's a lot of comment about the very sort of high trust loose arrangements at the start. I don't think there would be a good argument to extend quite that looseness into an extension. You could be a bit more focused and more rigorous around that.
Okay, so
but
for example, say if you're a hospitality business and you can't open your restaurant, then you can get an extension of the wage subsidy. That's what you're saying?
Yeah, and the reality is that the Prime Minister said. Somebody asked her about this, and she said, "Oh, well, they've had 12 weeks' pay. Worst case, it might only be 8 weeks. Effectively, they're still ahead," which seemed to me to be very short-sighted in the sense that it's not as if most businesses are going to go up to 100% trade on day one. There's going to be a long, slow tail that they're going to have to work their way through. And of course, the wages are only a part of the expenses that they've had to cover. They're dealing with rent and all sorts of other costs, which have made it very difficult.
What about cash payments directly to businesses? Is that something that you'd?
Well, that's the other prime opportunity, because there's a lot of question around rent. I think the government should have moved to some sort of code of conduct like they have in Australia, which has made it a bit more explicit that there should be sharing of pain between landlords and renters. But the problem with focusing on particular elements is that every business is different and has different requirements. And so the argument for some cash payment is strong. The difficulty that we have here at the moment, though, in New Zealand is it's very difficult to know the real situation. We've seen unemployment going up. I think the latest figures are close to 110,000 on the job seeker, up from around 80,000. But you've got 1.6 million on the wage subsidy. So it's hard to know how many of those 1.6 million could end up losing their jobs at the end of the wage subsidy period. And so it is very difficult to know the scale of the problem. Our sense is it's very substantial, and it's certainly made more difficult by being ultra conservative on the lockdown. Okay,
sure, Paul. I just want to be really clear, though. It's difficult for me to gauge your exact position on this. You're open to extending wage subsidies, that you would be open to that. You'd support that if it was targeted, and you might be supportive of targeted cash payments.
Yeah, the broad point we're making is that there is a good argument for further support or further relief for the businesses most affected.
Okay.
There are different ways that you could deliver that. One would be some sort of cash payment. Another would be an extension of the wage subsidy. Now, there's been efforts around the government-backed loans system as well. I don't think that's having a significant impact so far, and it hasn't been widely picked up on. But that's another potential route.
Okay, for those larger businesses that are much bigger and they can't get that government or taxpayer underwritten loan from the bank, the government's considering things like buying equity in those companies. Now, it's saying that this would only be for a very sort of limited number of companies and in certain situations. What's your view on that?
Well, I wouldn't be rushing into it. You can't rule anything out in this environment that we're in, and an element of pragmatism is required. But as I think the Minister of Finance pointed out, their businesses are having success at raising extra capital or bonds on the market at the moment, and that should be the first port of call to get people through if we possibly can. But it all comes back to opening up as much of the economy as soon as we can.
Okay, Paul, helicopter money is something that people have been interested in this week. The government hasn't sort of ruled it in or out. Everything's on the table. You're not a fan?
Oh, well, look, the simple point I was making yesterday, and I'll continue to make, is that before he starts shoveling the cash out of the chopper, he should focus on saving jobs. And that's around business relief. That should be the real priority, reducing the number of people that are thrown into unemployment. That will have long-lasting and massive effects on individuals and the broader community. So we should be absolutely focused on that. There will be a time where some sort of stimulus is justified once we're out of lockdown and people can actually get out and spend. And there are different mechanisms. So I think I'm open to a broader stimulus. I'm skeptical as to whether just giving a dose of money to everybody, including the significant parts of the population who haven't had a pay cut and who have got through this relatively economically unscathed, it seems to me to be they'd need to come up with a good explanation for that.
Okay. And do you think it was a good idea for the government to raise benefits by about $25 across some of the main benefits?
Well, look, I mean, that was clearly something that they wanted to do in the budget. And the only point we made when they brought that in as a supposed COVID response over 4 years was that it wasn't really something that was primarily focused on responding to the COVID situation.
Yeah.
An increase in benefits in 3 or 4 years' time is not, it can no way be connected with a response to COVID. And it was all part of the $12.1 billion that the Prime Minister cobbled together to say that it was the biggest stimulus that they'd ever done. So
Sure.
it was a bit of smoke and mirrors about how it was connected to COVID that we objected to primarily.
Paul, but do you accept that if I, say I lost my job and say I had a mortgage to pay and I have to go on the job seekers benefit, then and it's now been boosted, I think, to $250, I believe it is, for an individual, and a bit more for families. But that is by no means much money. Do you see the need for those levels to actually be higher, given the number of people who are going to be on that is going to be that much higher?
Absolute focus needs to be on saving jobs and reducing the number of people that are thrown into that situation. And that's why it's so important that we get out of this lockdown as soon as we can, and that the business relief is sufficient in order to try and reduce the number of job losses.
But
that's the critical thing.
People are going to lose their jobs. And does that benefit level actually need to be higher? Even though it has been boosted, does it need to go?
Look, I think it's been significantly boosted at the moment, and that's something that the government will have to weigh up in terms of the spending priorities.
What do you think?
I wouldn't be in favour of a permanent long-term increase in benefit levels. It is critical for the future growth of the economy and getting people back to work, that there is a clear benefit of getting back to work. And so if benefit levels are substantially higher, then you start to run into real problems with the difference between work and benefits. And so, look, they've increased those benefits, and that's justifiable at the moment, but I wouldn't be looking at any long-term increases at the moment.
Okay. Paul Goldsmith, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. And I'm Jenée Tibshraeny from interests.co.nz.